What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay. So Nightwing the New Order is, well, to be quite frank with you guys, it's one of the best comic book stories I've read in a long time. I absolutely love this whole thing because this gives us a version of Nightwing that we've never really seen before. But the cool thing about this is that we initially pick up really just with Dick Grayson himself. And the problem is, or at least what seems to have happened, is that somewhere along the line, all the powers have effectively been deactivated. Everybody out there that's got superpowers, and by an extension of their gene, have effectively just been shut off. What we end up finding out here is that Dick Grayson is the one that did this, that Dick Grayson had a device at his disposal that he used that essentially shut off the powers of almost every single superhero on Earth. Now, the reason why I say almost is because what we'll actually find out is not every superhero or supervillain have lost their powers, but those individuals whose abilities are directly tied into their genes, meaning that their cells are what allows them to do the kind of things they do, they lose their power. So Superman comes crashing down and is effectively mortal. He's just as vulnerable as any normal human being. And we end up finding out that some massive battle seems to have taken place in the city of Metropolis. Some massive conflict's been going on here, and the result was that Dick Grayson basically shut everybody's powers down because he was simply tired of it all. Now, this is cool because at this point, we end up jumping forward about 12 years later to Arthur Light. Now, Arthur Light also goes by the name of Dr. Light, and as far as I'm aware, he's the original. But Dr. Light had the ability to basically manipulate the light spectrum, and he could do it for a variety of different effects. And so because of this, Dr. Light is one of the more powerful beings out there, but is a person that seems to have basically been able to maintain his powers. Now, the result is that in this instance, what this really seems to hit at is that currently it's illegal to have powers. A person is not allowed to have any superpowers whatsoever. And of course, once he's subdued, Arthur is basically taken away. And then we get this sort of, this explanation essentially that, we're picking up one, in Gotham City in the year 2040, and two, legislation has been passed that has basically banned superpowers. The way this whole thing works, at least as it's explained by Dick Grayson, is he's the one that's basically taken the step to kind of be the figurehead of this whole thing. And so it's really cool because he's a lot of a very much like a celebrity in that regard in terms of how people view him. But he's kind of leading this group called the Crusaders. And the Crusaders quite literally go out and they essentially capture individuals who have powers. Either their powers are newly emerging or they've always maintained their powers and simply just managed to escape any measure of captivity or something along those lines. And so because of that, where Dick Grayson shouldn't normally go into the field, he usually does, if for no other reason to kind of recapture the excitement that he experienced back when he was Nightwing, back when he was, basically fighting alongside Batman. But at this point, we transition back to what really kind of seems like Wayne Manor. And it's kind of cool because what you have here is basically Alfred Pennyworth. And Alfred's whole thing is basically kind of play like a father figure in a lot of ways to Dick Grayson, because at this point in the story, Batman is dead. Not only that, Dick Grayson has a son. This is kind of intriguing because what they end up hitting at is the idea that basically the wife of Dick Grayson had essentially walked out, that she had basically walked away from the whole thing. And Alfred kind of hints at it, he sort of asks the question, hey, look, does Jake ever ask about her? If he does, what answer do you give? But in truth, Nightwing really kind of tries to avoid the whole discussion. Dick Grayson tries to walk away from it, which at that point, it begins to shift to the motivation as to whether or not it's the right thing. Now, this is important, and this is cool, because when it comes to Alfred, he's always been that guy, right? Like, Alfred has always been the voice, the conscience in the back of Bruce Wayne's mind. And with Bruce Wayne being out of the picture, that kind of follows on to Dick Grayson, since he's really the one that seems to seek out the counsel of Alfred Pennyworth with regards to various things. And so it is an interesting scenario, because what we end up finding out is that Dick Grayson's son was basically being bullied at school, but where he initially put on the idea that, well, he's just being bullied because there's kids there who were just kind of bullying. We end up finding out that this kid, Chris Ramsey, that was bullying Jake, was basically the nephew, I think, of Arthur Light. And so that's why he was really kind of lashing out, is because in his mind, Dick Grayson is the one responsible for putting his uncle in jail. And if Dick Grayson can't be attacked by Chris Ramsey, he'll do the next best thing, which is the son of Dick Grayson. But it is sort of intriguing, because this is kind of like a moral debate here that goes on between him and his son. But with regards to this, it brings in the whole idea of, well, hey, look, the world was a bad place. It was a rough place. And I, as Dick Grayson, fixed it by removing the source of the problem, which was everybody who had superpowers. And when the question's asked, do you regret doing that? Do you ever wish that you hadn't done that? In the end, he says no, because the good outweighed the bad. But that's the crazy thing about this scenario, is because what ends up happening is Dick Grayson is called to school, and apparently the coach is the quote unquote only one who saw this happen. And when Dick Grayson shows up and he's taken to the boys' locker locker room, what we end up finding out is that Jake has powers. And when you're Dick Grayson and you're basically the face of this institution that exists for the purpose of rounding up anybody with powers and then either throwing them in stasis because you can't find a way to cure them of their powers, or else inoculating them and removing their powers entirely, what do you do when one of those people is your son? And that's where everything changes. And that's why this story is so cool, because what we do is we kind of jump back and we get this sort of explanation with regards to everything that was going on. And what we have is really this sort of discussion that it all kind of really started with Superman. Superman was like the first hero to show up on Earth. They kind of set off the superhero renaissance. When Superman went public and said, hey, I have powers and I'm here to save Metropolis, well, then suddenly all these people started stepping up. Now, what this meant was that it was only ever a matter of time before something happened. All we know is that somewhere along the line, all these different superheroes and supervillains effectively went to war with one another. And the battles were intense and the battles were extreme. Now, this is giving us this kind of major conflict here, but in truth, what it really says is there were a lot of like small skirmishes and then some massive war broke out. And when this war happened, Dick Grayson sat down and said, enough's enough. And what he basically did is he activated this device and shut down the superpowers of everybody on Earth, or at least seemingly everybody on Earth. But in response to this, he basically became a kind of celebrity that people were like, Dick Grayson is the one who saved the world. Dick Grayson is the one who made the world a better place. And where he kind of shied away from this initially, after a while, he sort of began to revel in it. Not only that, as soon as this legislation was passed that made it illegal for anybody to have superpowers, people were desperate. There were various individuals who sided with superheroes. They didn't have powers, but they were executing these campaigns where they were trying to assassinate Dick Grayson, trying to take him out. All these things really came to a head whereby eventually it was the formation of a quote unquote new order that served the purpose of policing superpowers. If people have powers and no one knows how to cure them, they're thrown in stasis. If individuals do have powers and these powers can be deactivated, they're shut down. Now, the way that this is done, the scientific side, actually comes from Michael Holt. Michael Holt is a guy named Mr. Terrific, for those of you guys who are not familiar. And Mr. Terrific is effectively one of the smartest people out there. And where Dick Grayson simply asked the question, what's going on here? Is it possible to neutralize my son's powers? Michael Holt says, no. Like your son has had these powers for about a year. He's basically been hiding them from you. When the question is asked by Dick Grayson, why didn't you tell me? Jake's response was, well, you said people with superpowers are bad, and I didn't want you to think that I was a bad person. And it's kind of heartbreaking, because the funny thing about this is Jake is a little kid. He looks at the world through the eyes of a little kid. All he knows is what he's been told. He just follows this kind of linear progression. If I tell my dad I have superpowers, my dad will think I am bad. It's simple, but that's how children think in a lot of different ways. And so because of that, this ultimately kind of culminates with this whole discussion in, alongside Alfred Pennyworth. And it's a pretty big deal because Alfred kind of hints at the idea that there's a more sinister reason for why Batman was dead. But it's also cool because where Alfred is a person who is pragmatic, who's more reasonable, he sits down and looks at Jake and says, look, not everybody who had superpowers was inherently bad. Some of these people were good, but your dad believes that he's probably doing the right thing. The issue with this is that really early in the morning, essentially all the alarms go off and we basically have the Crusaders invade the entirety of the house and effectively have the intention of grabbing Jay Grayson and taking him away because of the fact that he's got powers. Now, Alfred does what Alfred always does and basically says, look, I'm an old man, but like I'll whoop your ass with the best of them. Alfred doesn't take any crap from anybody. But of course, this plays out exactly as we would expect. Alfred goes to attack one of the guys with a baseball bat. Alfred is shot and killed. Now, initially, Jake's powers start to flare up. And it's sort of interesting because we don't really see what he's capable of right off the bat. Instead, he's immediately inoculated. He's basically knocked out and Dick Grayson is taken away under the auspices that he effectively harbored the powers of a superpowered person, regardless of that person's relation to Dick Grayson himself. And so at this point, we switch over to Washington, D.C., and we pick up with Batwoman. We'll find out more about what's going on with her here in a minute. But, she, of course, knows exactly what's going on with Dick Grayson and with Jake Grayson. And initially, it's kind of like, hey, look, don't go in there. Don't interrogate him. Don't talk to him. Don't look at him. Do nothing until I get there. Now, where one of the cops, Brady, takes this as kind of a challenge of sorts, where he sort of looks at Dick Grayson and says, this guy's got no powers. I'm not too worried about this guy. The reason why Batwoman told him that was not for the benefit of Dick Grayson. It was for the benefit of them. It was for their own safety. Because, let's be honest, guys, this is Dick Grayson we're talking about. And so basically where he's taunted a little bit, considered to be washed up, considered to be an older guy, at the end of the day, he just picks his handcuffs and immediately takes these guys out and then engineers his own escape. And it's cool. And so what we end up doing is having Dick Grayson travel over to the home of Tim Drake. And that's kind of cool because Tim Drake has settled down. He's walked away from that whole life. He's not Red Robin. He's got a wife. He's got a couple of kids. He's basically enjoying the peace and prosperity of his own life. But this is is Tim Drake, which means his intelligence is just as good as it always was. And so what ends up happening here is Dick Grayson, of course, shows up and says, I need to know where my son's being held. Now, the other half of this is that it kind of sends him on this journey of sorts to basically go through and look around and try to find these different aspects of, where these individuals might be. One of the first place he heads is the Batcave. And the funny thing about this is that when Bruce Wayne's identity was outed as Batman following his death, the Batcave turned into a tourist attraction. For $40, you can go and tour the Batcave. The other half of this is that there's the Batcave, then there's like the sublevels and the sublevels, and the levels below that. I mean, it's crazy, how far the whole thing goes down. And so really the Batcave is known to people only on the surface. And so it's kind of like this giant cave you go into and you tour and you look at the computers and you look at the Batwing and you look at the Batmobile and then, you take your pictures and then you go about your business and then that's really about it. But if you know the right places to access, if you know where to get into, then you know all the stuff that's there. And what we end up finding out is a lot of these things haven't changed. A lot of these things are still there. The costume of Nightwing is still there. The various devices and artifacts that Batman used to use are still housed down in that sublevel. At this point, we end up picking up with the whole idea of why Batwoman harbors this kind of vendetta against Dick Grayson. And what we end up finding out is that, of course, she basically works in Washington. And in a lot of ways, she was the one that basically created the whole organized system in terms of like the Crusaders and the government side and the kind of paramilitary system as it functions now. But Dick Grayson was the one who took everybody's powers down. And so because Dick Grayson was a celebrity, Dick Grayson was the one who was put in charge of the program. And so effectively, Batwoman built the whole thing and then she was removed as head of the whole project and Dick Grayson was put in her place. And he just kind of rode into the sunset with us, said, yeah, man, I'll do it. I got no problem with that. And that's where you kind of run into this rift because where Dick Grayson immediately takes off and says, okay, first order of business, gotta find my son. He's immediately met by John Stewart, the Green Lantern. And this is cool because what we end up finding out here is that John Stewart is working alongside the federal government as part of this whole group that exists out there to just capture people. Now, the other half of this is that with regards to Dick Grayson himself, because of the fact that he's so capable in terms of his abilities, and because Batman designed a lot of these artifacts to fight against superheroes should they ever go rogue, Dick Grayson's in possession of a set of gauntlets that can basically pierce the hard-like constructs of the Green Lantern. And so at the end of the day, the powers of John Stewart don't really amount to much. The problem with this is that this is John Stewart. John Stewart was a Marine. John Stewart is one of the best Green Lanterns out there. Anybody who manages to outwit John Stewart doesn't do so for long. And that's exactly what happens to Dick Grayson. Despite the fact that he is pretty capable, he is an older guy. And so the result is that John Stewart ultimately ends up getting the upper hand. But where we would expect to see John Stewart completely and totally defeated, Dick Grayson is whisked away. And we end up finding out him being removed was done at the hands of Starfire, Corey, as well as the Flash, Wally West. And so it's cool, man. That's why I say this story is so interesting. This story is wild in terms of how all this unfolds. Now, of course, moving back over to Batwoman, it's really very much a discussion that goes on with regards to the whole thing of like, Jake and her talking about everything. It is interesting because the question that's asked from Jake is, are you going to freeze me? Am I going to be frozen? Am I going to be put in stasis because you don't know how to shut my powers down? You don't know how to handle them. Now, this of course indicates that Jake is somewhat aware of what's going on. The other half of this is that Batwoman is cold. She's really kind of like hardcore, like, hey, look, there's going to be a battery of tests. You're going to be put through all different kinds of tests. And when you are, like, you're going to have to get some rest and you're going to have to toughen up because some very hard times are ahead for you. But again, switching back over to Nightwing, we basically end up having him come to, by extension, Corey, by Starfire, Beast Boy, who's basically stuck in this animal form because of the fact that when his powers were shut down, he didn't revert to his previous form. He was stuck in the form that he was in at the time. Of course, Wally West has his powers because remember, this is one of those instances where powers were, affected those individuals whose genes allowed them to use various abilities. When it comes to Wally West, he's not like made of the Speed Force. And so it's not like the Speed Force is confined within his genes. Instead, it's just a source of energy he taps into. But one of the more interesting things here, and this is something that I want you to notice, is that we have a Blue Lantern here. And this Blue Lantern is Lois Lane. We're not told how Lois Lane became a Blue Lantern. We're just told that she is. But the problem with this is that neither of the Titans themselves, know where Jake Grayson is being held, nor does Dick himself. And so at this point, it's kind of trying to figure out what in the world is going on and how to access those different things, or at least how to access his son. The question that was being asked by Dick Grayson for quite some time is, we don't have all the superheroes, where are they operating out of? What we end up finding out is they were operating out of Bloodhaven, the one place Dick Grayson would never expect. For those of you guys who don't know, Bloodhaven is Dick Grayson's own version of Gotham City, basically. That's kind of the whole thing that goes on there. But the other thing that this deals with is the whole struggle between like Dick Grayson and Starfire, because what we end up finding out is Starfire is the mother of Jake. She's the wife that that Dick Grayson married and the one who walked away. But a lot of this was because of the fact that when it came to Dick Grayson going on this crusade, it really turned Starfire off to him because she saw him as really more of like a dictator. And so it effectively drew a rift between the two of them. And so of course, what we end up finding out is they basically locate where it is that Jake is being held. And of course, they basically orchestrate an attempt to go there and to essentially free him. But when they get in there, they end up finding out the entire facility is basically being ran by Mr. Freeze, or at least it looks like Mr. Freeze. It might be kind of like a Freeze robot or something along those lines. But the fact remains here that what ends up happening is, Victor Freeze effectively shoots these darts out. They incapacitate Wally West. People turn to Lois Lane and say, look, you've got a Blue Lantern ring, you got to help us out. But of course, the cool thing about this is Kyle Higgins really grabs the existing Green Lantern concepts as they were basically created by Jeff Johns and says, look, the Blue Lantern rings are not all powerful on their own. The Blue Lantern rings need to be in the company of a Green Lantern ring in order to be able to operate at their peak capacity. And so what ends up happening is, of course, Lois Lane is able to use her powers to basically, start orchestrating their freedom. But then Jake kind of lashes out, freaks out, and then just sort of blows a hole in the whole thing and allows the entire group to escape, which is cool because he basically provides their out. But it hits at the idea that there's a kind of power here that he possesses. Now, most likely, and what we'll end up finding out is this is basically the power of Corey. That it's essentially, it seems like the exact same power as Starfire. The ability to kind of manipulate, solar energies and different things like that. But it is going to be kind of cool because what they end up doing is going through and basically start, analyzing the genes of Jake to see what Jake's capable of, to see what his powers are. But what they end up doing is basically transitioning away from Bloodhaven itself and traveling to a new location, basically traveling to Metropolis. And when they get there, well, we end up having all these forces who descend on them, these various gangs and individuals like that. We end up fighting the group is met with the arrival of Superman. So again, this is cool because Superman's powerless. Clark Kent does not have any powers, but he's basically working alongside Lex Luthor. And this is cool because it's one of those things where it's like, look, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and in this moment right now, where Superman and Lex Luthor had been enemies for years and years and years and years, the fact that they share a common enemy in the form of this massive government surveillance registration system means they effectively kind of have to work together. Now, the other half of this is we end up finding out the reason why the attempts to shut down Jake's powers weren't working was not because of the fact that Jake's powers cannot necessarily be deactivated, but because Jake's abilities are basically working against the inoculation, meaning Jake is an effectively a cure. Jake is the means by which Lex Luthor, if he's able to basically utilize Jake correctly in terms of the powers, analyze them right, and synthesize a cure, can basically start giving people their powers back. And it is kind of cool because we end up having this conversation that takes place between Jake and Superman. And what we end up finding out is that the death of Batman came at the hands of Superman. That Superman was basically under the control of Black Kryptonite, which kind of drove him insane. And in turn, he essentially totally obliterated Batman. Now, this seems to be the catalyst. This seems to be what set it all in motion. The death of Batman kind of sent Dick Grayson over the edge. And when you had all these different conflicts that were breaking out with all these superheroes, Dick Grayson looked around and said, okay, so Superman was controlled by Black Kryptonite, and because he was so powerful, he totally obliterated Batman. I mean, he was basically being controlled. Who knows what he could do with all this power he possesses, and he's just the tip of the iceberg. So Dick Grayson says the most pragmatic thing to do and the most practical thing to do is to nip it in the bud, shut it all down. And he took everybody's powers away. And that was really about it. And so where this group is kind of working together, where Dick Grayson is really kind of being held in stasis, what ends up happening is Dick communicates with Batwoman and essentially says, look, I've got a plan. I can give you what you want if you give me what I want. And so this means he essentially betrays the entire group. He grabs his son and says, okay, come on, we've got a safe place. We're going to get out of here. They essentially take off. When they do, they're met by the arrival of like Green Lantern. They're met by the arrival. It looks like Captain Atom. Of course, there's also Captain Cold. I mean, there's, Red Tornado, these superheroes that we've seen in DC Comics, or even supervillains that we've seen in DC Comics. Some of them seem to have been militarized in the sense that it's like, okay, look, either you're with us or against us. If you're against us, you're going in the freezer, you're going in the meat locker. But if you're with us, then you get your freedom, you get your autonomy, and they basically ended up choosing. Now, again, a lot of this background were not given to us. It's not really explained here. Dick Grayson basically says, look, the entire group you want is in there. Me and my son were leaving. We're going to a whole nother country. And this is kind of intriguing here because for Dick Grayson, when he's basically leaving with his son presents this really, really compelling argument. And that's one of the core components here. The price you pay for being young is that in a lot of ways, you see the world for what it could be, not the way it is. That's not a bad thing because when you're kind of an adult and you look around and you say, yep, the world's this way, and you just kind of throw your hands in the air and say, well, I mean, it's never going to get any better than this, then of course it's not going to get any better than that. But humanity is what changes the world. Humanity's at the top. And that's the case his son presents. Dick Grayson kind of presents this argument and he says, look, you've seen videos, you've seen photos, but you see it in hindsight. You weren't there. You don't know what it was like to wake up in fear every single day and not know if today was going to be your last day. You have no idea what it's like to live in that kind of fear. But the response of Jake is to say, yeah, but I mean, Batman knew all that stuff. Batman knew how dark the world could be. He knew how screwed up the world could be, but Batman kept fighting. And the one thing that kept him from going over the edge was you. It was you keeping him sane. It was you being the anchor that kept him from just falling into the abyss of the ocean. It was you being a lifeline to always pull him back whenever he strayed away too far. And I always kind of wished I could be like that. I wish I could be like you when you were Robin for Batman. And this is huge. This is a huge thing because it brings Dick Grayson back. It really kind of yanks him back to the reality of the situation that at the end of the day, sure, there are people out there who abuse their powers, who use their powers for nefarious purposes. But Superman was a good guy. Wonder Woman was a good person. Batman was a good person. You had more heroes doing good things than you had villains doing bad things. And so at the end of the day, most people who develop their powers, they probably have some sort of crisis, or maybe they end up realizing they can do bad things with them. But what it takes is guidance. It takes a helping hand to teach them, look, you've got incredible abilities. But as we all know from the Spider-Man quote, with great power must come great responsibility. If you have the power to fix things, you have the responsibility to fix things. And so with that power that you possess, you have to do good with it. And so Dick Grayson effectively turns the car around. And good thing he did too, because the Teen Titans were getting wrecked. They were basically on the verge of dying. There was no possible way they were going to be able to pull this off. But because of the fact that Jake is the standard by which Lex Luthor can effectively synthesize this cure, what ends up happening is Lex Luthor hooks Jake up to the machine, starts, channeling this sort of, cure essence, this energy of sorts into Superman. Superman regains his powers and we're off to the races. It's one of the coolest things. The guy pops back up and says, okay, let's do this. The problem with this is that Lex Luthor effectively has this kind of bomb that's sitting under Metropolis. And where the bomb will basically bring everybody's powers back, it'll destroy the entirety of Metropolis in the process. Now, where Metropolis is kind of a wasteland in a lot of ways, in the sense that there's a lot of buildings that have been destroyed, people are still kind of experiencing the fallout of the massive war between the Metahumans. At the end of the day, there are still people who live there. And this is classic Superman. This is classic superhero storytelling. If there are people who live here and we can't get them out of harm's way, then it's our responsibility to neutralize the threat. And that's Superman's idea. Everybody who has the ability to help me out and lift this giant chunk of land out into the atmosphere, then help me do this. Everybody else, go through and start evacuating people. And this whole thing basically has the entire city of Metropolis elevated, or at least this giant bomb, elevated up into the air so that when it goes off, nobody's killed. And effectively this, everybody's powers start emerging again. And so as a result, we see this kind of, again, Kingdom Come-esque situation in the sense that where Kingdom Come saw a massive civil war among the metahumans and the world was almost destroyed, this wasn't necessarily the same thing, but what it did do is it started ushering in this sort of light-handed touch in the sense that the world kind of looked around and said, okay, so maybe Dick Grayson's standard was pretty heavy-handed to just shut down the powers of everyone. Maybe that was pretty extreme. There are people out there who are emerging with powers. They should be taught how to use those powers effectively. And so that's what ended up happening. What we ended up having go on here is that the entire concept of all superpowers being outlawed was effectively lifted. Instead, what they did is they started putting in, essentially registration, the idea that people that had powers had to effectively register their powers. But it was kind of a cool idea because at the end of the day, the entire idea began to move in the direction of, okay, so like for 5 years after this whole, the return of powers were still illegal, but once it was removed, the world started moving in the direction of, okay, so like we're gonna have people who are gonna start gaining powers. There's no possible way to stop that. Why not use that to create a utopia? Why not use that to find ways to make the world a better place? But again, things wrap up pretty fast. We basically end up having Jake who basically gets married, they have a kid of their own and it's kind of leaving the world better for them. But again, there's a lot of storytelling that can be told here. There's a lot of background stuff that can go on, a lot of filling in the cracks between what happened. I mean, I would love to read a one-shot story about how Lois Lane became a Blue Lantern. I would love to read a miniseries about what Superman was doing during this 12-year period that landed him up to this point. DC, if you are seeing this, make those stories for the love of God. Just call them like New Order preludes or New Order one-shots or whatever you want to call it, but write those stories for the love of God. Please write those stories. I would love to see those things so much. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like and I will catch you all later. Peace.